Good morning. I'm Edward Jeredjian, the director of the Baker Institute here at Rice University, and I want to warmly welcome you this morning to the Institute's conference on moving beyond the war on drugs. The Baker Institute has brought together advocates and people of different views on some key issues that our country and our world faces, and we had in the last couple of years a major conference here on global climate change, in which we had advocates, both scientists, economists, politicians of various views address this key issue that has obviously national and global implications, and we produced a very balanced and very good policy recommendations to decision makers both in the public and private sector. We've also had several years ago a major conference on U.S. tax policy and basically looking at the consumption tax as a possible alternative to the income tax, which again is a highly controversial issue, which has very important implications. And that too, we are producing a book that's going to be published by Cambridge University Press on the assessments and policy options and recommendations of that. So in that sort of stream of key issues that the Institute is taking on, this one, of course, is one of the most important ones that our nation and the world faces, and the whole issue of drugs with very important domestic, societal, economic, legal, and international ramifications. You've seen the program. You see we have a wide array of experts and individuals who have various views on these issues, and everyone that I know of is trying to search for some sort of middle way between existing policy and some of the alternatives. Maybe there is not a middle way, but basically what we're going to look at during the course of this conference is the various aspects, the assessments, the analysis, the policy options that people bring to our table of discussion here at the Baker Institute. And what we plan to do is to produce a policy recommendation to decision makers on the results of the conference. So in that frame of reference, I'm delighted to introduce the man, the professor and the scholar and the expert at Rice University, Professor Bill Martin, who is a Baker Institute Senior Fellow and a very senior and respected professor here at Rice University, who is an expert on issues of criminologist. He is an expert on religion and many other issues. So it's my real pleasure to ask Bill Martin to come and make some welcoming remarks. Bill.
Well, I join Ambassador Jeredjian in welcoming you to what I believe will be an important conference. I'm especially delighted to see a large proportion of almost all of the participants here this morning. I'd seen most of them last night, but in a dream I had about 4 o'clock this morning, a number of them failed to show up. And in fact, I missed this particular session myself, but I'm all better now. I suspect that no one disagrees with the proposition that drugs can cause enormous harm. They can ruin the lives of those who use them and those whose lives they affect, that they're implicated in a wide range of crimes and are associated with activities that enrich criminals, endanger innocent citizens of numerous countries, involve terrorism, and threaten or seriously undercut the development and practice of democracy. There is, however, considerable disagreement over the nature and extent of that harm, the factors that contribute to its many facets, and the best way to go about addressing the numerous issues that cluster under the umbrella of the drug problem. And for far too long, those who disagree over these issues have talked mainly to those who agreed with them, which can be reassuring and comfortable, but has not led to much mutual understanding or sharing of information and ideas and perspectives that might foster more cooperative and perhaps more effective ways of dealing with these complex issues. There are signs that the climate on this may be changing. that people who are deeply concerned to reduce the negative effects of both drugs and the efforts to control them are taking a second look at some of the ways we have approached these matters. For example, that there's much more openness to treatment as an option to incarceration. An example is just one aspect of this problem. Numerous significant figures, including former drug czar General Barry McCaffrey, have observed that it may be short-sighted to think we can imprison our way out of the drug problem. New York Governor George Pataki surprised everyone last year by calling for significant changes in the Rockefeller drug laws, which involve mandatory minimum sentences for a number of drug charges. Connecticut Governor John Rowland has urged his fellow Republicans to address the diversion of more drug offenders into treatment instead of incarceration. Secretary of State Colin Powell at the 2000 Republican Convention lamented the large number of young black men in prison on drug charges. And President Bush, who, like his major rivals Al Gore and Bill Bradley, admits to having used marijuana, doesn't admit but doesn't deny having used other substances, has acknowledged difficulties with alcohol and has family members with drug problems, has wisely observed that, quote, a lot of people are coming to the realization that maybe long minimum sentences for first-time users may not be the best way to occupy jail space and/or heal people from their diseases. It's just one example of one issue here. Now, in these 2 days, we will not have as much opportunity to share differing perspectives as we had hoped for. We do have a remarkable collection of experts gathered here. They don't represent one view or even just two. We don't have all viewpoints fully represented, and we simply don't have time to address all aspects of the problem. And not everyone in a position to contribute importantly has accepted the invitation to do so. We will, however, have more opportunity for fruitful exchange than is often the case, and we should all be appreciative of that opportunity. We have a rich 2 days before us. The Baker Institute, in keeping with a long-standing ethos of civility at Rice University, is pleased to serve as a convener of events at which people who hold different views gather and can express them freely with the expectation of serious attention and thoughtful response. I have a pretty fair idea of approximately where most of the speakers stand on the issues we'll be discussing. I honestly have very little idea about the convictions of most of you who have accepted our invitation to be here as part of the audience. But I'm confident that you share with me the conviction that some of the unfortunately common responses to views with which one disagrees, such as a softly muttered balderdash, or the voting by applause that elongates the State of the Union message each year, that this is not really an adequate substitute for a well-formed question or argument. And I know we can count on everyone here to uphold that tradition. As Ambassador Jurigian has said, that we will take written questions for both of the first two speakers today, and they will be picked up and passed along to me. I want to say one other thing, that we have such a tight program that we don't have restroom breaks built into this day, either day. But there are restrooms here. There are men's and ladies' restroom on this side, the gentleman's restroom on the side, and if you happen to be unisex, there is a unisex restroom in the back of the room, and you're welcome to come in and out as you need to there. Like you, I'm anxious to get started, and I'm truly excited about our keynote event. I'm going to ask Ambassador Jurigian to come back to the stand to introduce our keynote speaker.
It's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker, the Honorable Asa Hutchinson, who has served as Administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration since August of 2001. While serving his third term in the United States Congress, Mr. Hutchinson was tapped by President Bush to join the administration and was confirmed with a bipartisan vote of 98-1, which is quite remarkable. And I've got to tell you, Mr. Hutchinson, that in the galleries there, the honorary chair of the Baker Institute is also very proud of his confirmation votes. And you're competing with him very closely, and I'm going to be delighted to tell him that, because I think he had a 97, but a 98 one too, so you're in the same ballpark there. He has practiced law in rural Arkansas for 21 years before being elected to Congress in 1995. During that time, he was appointed by President Reagan as U.S. Attorney for Western Arkansas, and at the ripe age of 31, he was the youngest United States attorney in the nation. During his tenure as U.S. Attorney, the FBI awarded Mr. Hutchinson a citation for a successful prosecution of a terrorist group in northern Arkansas known as the Covenant, sword and arm of the Lord. Wearing a flak jacket, he assisted in the negotiations that led to a peaceful conclusion to what had become a tense three-day standoff between the heavily armed paramilitary group and some 200 law enforcement officers. He has personally tried over 100 jury trials ranging from cocaine distribution to securities fraud to murder. While in Congress, Mr. Hutchinson continued his leadership in the fight against drugs by serving on the House Judiciary Committee and the Select Committee on Intelligence. He served on the Speaker's Task Force for a Drug-Free America, charged with finding new approaches to reduce drug use among the nation's youth. During the impeachment and trial of President Bill Clinton, Mr. Hutchinson served as one of the House managers charged with conducting the trial in the Senate, and he won much public praise, I remember, for his attempts to reach across the aisle and find common ground, and he succeeded in that quite remarkably. And the National Journal's 2000 Almanac of American Politics noted that he played a mediating role on impeachment. He struck a positive, open-minded, even friendly tone that was sharply in contrast with much of the discourse on the issue. As head of the DEA, Mr. Hutchinson has concentrated on effective enforcement strategies while recognizing the need for increased treatment and education programs. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Hutchinson to the Baker Institute Power.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It is a pleasure to be at Rice University and more specifically at the James Baker III Institute on Policy. And I also want to express my appreciation to Professor Martin for his comments earlier and for this invitation. I am a great admirer of Secretary Baker, and if he asked me to be anywhere, I would be there. And I appreciate his extraordinary service to our country and his friendship. But I also like to have challenges in life, and I consider debating drug policy or discussing drug policy a significant challenge, but also an opportunity to articulate the facts that are important in developing policy that's going to shape our future and impact so greatly the next generation. Professor Martin mentioned, or excuse me, the ambassador mentioned in the introduction that I actually wore a flak jacket on one occasion in the past when I was negotiating the surrender of a terrorist organization. And I just want you to know I've not had the occasion to wear a flak jacket since, although there was one occasion in San Francisco when I actually discussed drug policy in San Francisco that I wish I had had a flak jacket on. But such is not the occasion at Rice University today. I consider this an opportunity in a very strong academic environment to discuss our nation's future. And it is important because it impacts in such an incredible way our family, our neighbors, and our communities. We are all touched in a very personal way by the impact of drugs. As you know, I'm from Arkansas. I represented the 3rd District of Arkansas for a number of years in Congress. I grew up there in Arkansas, and I'm very proud to be from that state. In Arkansas, we love football, specifically Razorback football. And I remember a game that is of epic proportions in Arkansas. It was October of 1966. It was a big game between Arkansas and Baylor University. Arkansas was ranked number 5 in the nation at the time. Our coach was the legendary Frank Broyles, And it was raining on this particular day, and he decided to play a conservative game. And if memory serves me well, we ultimately punted on 3rd down in a key situation, and as a result, the Razorbacks lost that game 7-0. And so, what does this have to do with drug policy? Well, I believe that there are some folks that would like to punt on 3rd down, not giving us a chance to move to 4th down and actually make a 1st down and have success in this effort. And I do not believe, though, that punting on 3rd down should reflect the true perspective on our efforts and the progress that we've made. There's too much at risk to punt on 3rd down. Many of you will remember the ad that was run during the Super Bowl this last year, which made the connection of drugs and terror and their linkage in our society and world today, and illustrated that buying drugs is not just illegal, it is not just harmful, but it very well could, in many instances, serve to fund violent groups. Now, I'll certainly offer a caveat that just because someone purchases drugs in this country does not mean they're automatically putting money in the hands of terrorists. I would not make that claim, neither does the ad make that claim. But at the same time, the connection is very clear. The drugs to money to terror relationship is historic, it is current, and it is threatening to our future. If you look across the globe, we see armed groups use illegal drug profits to fund their terrorist activities and to enforce control over the local population through violent activities. If you go down to Colombia, in war-torn Colombia, the insurgent group, the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, they raise funds from the drug trade to purchase weapons and to finance their attacks against innocent citizens and the democratic institutions in Colombia. We recently indicted Tomas Molinas. It is the first time that a leader of a terrorist organization has been indicted on drug trafficking charges. Subsequent to this, around the same time, President Pastrana decided to move the Colombian National Police and the military to reclaim a demilitarized zone. When that was done, the Colombian National Police discovered 2 major cocaine laboratories, seized 5 tons of processed cocaine from those laboratories, and discovered a 200-foot communications tower. It is the first evidence that this revolutionary group was involved so deeply from the beginning to the end in drug trafficking, from the cultivation to the processing to the distribution of cocaine that enters the United States. In Peru, the Shining Path guerrillas have reemerged and have been giving responsibility for the car bomb attack that preceded President Bush's visit to Peru. The Shining Path guerrillas are funded historically to a large extent from taxing the coca production. In the Middle East, terrorist groups such as the Palestinian group Hamas and Lebanon-based Hezbollah are involved in the drug trade to finance their terrorist activities. In Southeast Asia, you have the United Wall State Army that consists of over 16,000 armed combatants. They are funded and supported by profits from the methamphetamine trade as well as the heroin trade. If you move most recently to Southwest Asia, into Afghanistan, you see the Taliban that is now out of power. But when they were in power, they had their financial base in heroin trafficking, taxing it, and a more specific involvement as well. Many of the al-Qaeda associates were directly involved in drug trafficking, and the Taliban, of course, through their revenue, provided security for the terrorists that trained in that geographic region. And so there is a connection between drugs and terrorism. But the anti-drug effort is not just about violence in far-off places such as Colombia or Mexico. It is also about the high school student who drops out of school because of methamphetamine addiction, or the son who sacrifices a future because of an all-consuming cocaine habit, or a 50-year-old accountant who developed a heroin addiction and lost his family. These are real people with real heartaches that deserve real chances in life. And so there is much at risk, and we must pursue progress and not punt on third down. I would also think it is important that we not punt on third down because of the risk involved in the drug activity, but also because America can achieve success. One of the greatest myths of this decade is that there is no success in our anti-drug efforts in this country. Underlying myth. The facts are that cocaine drug use is down by 75% during the last 15 years. That is 4 million people fewer regularly using cocaine today than 15 years ago. Overall drug use has been reduced by 50% since it reached its peak level in the late 1970s. This is 9.3 million people fewer using drugs on a regular basis than during the height of the time in the late 70s. If we achieved this type of success in any other social arena, from domestic violence to child abuse, someone would be nominated to receive the Medal of Freedom. It is extraordinary progress that has been made, but clearly we have much more progress to make because the fact is there has been success in our anti-drug effort, but in recent years it has been stalled. Most of that success happened between 1982 and 1992. In 1993, our nation's attention was diverted to the Gulf War, resources were moved away from the anti-drug effort, and the legalization movement in our country gained momentum. Since 1993, drug use among teens has flattened, although there has been some hopeful signs in recent years. There are two conclusions that we can reach at this point. One of the conclusion is that we can think that we have reached the optimum level of reducing drug use in our country, and we can't do any better than we've done at the present time. The other conclusion to reach is that leadership in our nation and in our policy makes a difference, and we can reduce dependency even more than what has already been done. I believe it is the wrong conclusion to say that we have not made enough progress and that therefore we should move in a totally different policy direction by legalizing harmful drugs. To me, that is punting on third down when you have an opportunity to make more success. Now, if you look at the arguments that are raised by the legalization community, there are three basic arguments that are raised. The first one is that the drug war has been a failure. We've all heard that, and I've cited statistics that show that we have made progress, we have reduced drug usage in our country, and we can do more. And more than just statistics, though, they represent the lives that have been saved from drug addiction and drug usage. The second argument that is made by the legalizers is an economic argument. And some of you might have even been thinking about this economic argument whenever I recited the terrorists that derive money from drug trafficking. Well, let's discuss this economic argument that somehow if we legalize drugs, that would eliminate the profits and put the cartels, the criminal organizations, out of business. Analyze this. If drugs were legalized, you would have to legalize absolutely everything, even to have any hope of reducing the criminal element, and then they would still find the black market to deal in. If most people, when they talk about legalization, think about marijuana. If you legalize marijuana, does that put the cartels and the criminal organizations out of business? Well, of course it does not, because you have heroin, you have cocaine, you have methamphetamine. If you legalized heroin and cocaine, does that put them out of business? You still have methamphetamine to traffic in. If you legalize methamphetamine, does that put them out of business? Then you have ecstasy and the club drugs, the synthetically produced drugs. If you legalize all of those drugs, does that put them out of business? No, they would probably deal in OxyContin and other legal prescribed drugs, as well as other black market items on the drug scene. And so the fact is that you cannot legalize enough, you cannot decriminalize enough to put the cartels and the criminal organizations out of business. After Prohibition ended, did the organized crime element of our country go away? Of course it did not. The Cosa Nostra continued in their activity into the late 70s because at that time a concentrated enforcement effort actually did put them out of business. But it was not legalization that did that. Consider an article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal last week. It told of the arrest of a man in North Carolina who is providing funding to the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah. He was doing that by selling cigarettes on the black market. And so most people who think of legalization say we'll have a regulatory scheme. Well, a regulatory scheme on cigarettes did not stop a terrorist organization by making profit off the selling of cigarettes on the black market. And so legalization would not diminish the profit motive of the traffickers, and it would not diminish the need for law enforcement. The third argument that is made by the legalization community is that somehow if we legalize drugs, drug use would decline. Well, let's look, and that is an objective. Most people concede that these are harmful drugs that we're speaking about. Methamphetamine, ecstasy, they do harm. Marijuana, cocaine, they do harm physically to your body. And so if you want to discourage usage, and even those who want to legalize say, well, let's have civil penalties. Well, why do you have civil penalties? You have civil penalties because you want to discourage use. Well, if you want to, you discourage use because it is harmful. So how do you discourage use? And my argument would be that you discourage use in our society by keeping drugs in the illegal context, the criminal nature. And if you look at history, I think history tells us that this is the right approach. A legalized environment does not discourage use. We have not been engaged in this anti-drug effort in this country for 20 years. We've been engaged in this effort for over 120 years. In 1880, many drugs, including opium and cocaine, were legal. During that time, we had the highest level of drug use ever in our nation per capita. It was in a legalized context. There were over 400,000 opium addicts in our nation during that time frame. That's twice as many per capita as there are today. That was in a legalized structure. So clearly, drug abuse is a historic problem in our country. We have fought this fight before. We've tried legalization and learned that it brings increased addictions and social cost. And so we have had success in this effort. The laws of economics do not support a change in direction toward legalization. And history tells us that drug use goes up when the criminal law parameters are removed. That's the review of our past history. Let's look at the future direction as to where we should go. What about the strategy in the future? How do we make a first down? We do this with a strong program of enforcement. It is a critical element of any rational drug strategy. But we also need to have an increased effort on education and an increased emphasis upon treatment of those who have addiction problems. Enforcement is necessary because it puts a risk in trafficking and sends the right social parameters for behavior in our country. But if you look at enforcement alone, it is not going to do the job. It takes education to teach young people to make the right decisions in life, and it takes treatment to reduce the demand for those who have become and have developed an addiction problem. And so I think it is appropriate to debate drug policy within the parameters of the criminal context. What are the new ideas out there? What new things can we do to reduce dependency upon drugs and discourage people from moving that direction? And so we are open to new ideas like drug courts that provide strong treatment programs for those who have an addiction problem and are convicted of nonviolent crime, even felonies. And so I think that there is an appropriate realm for alternatives to incarceration for individuals with addiction problems, nonviolent crimes that need help, and that's what drug courts are about because they provide the treatment alternative with a strong measure of accountability. Jennifer Malloy is one of those graduates from Youngstown, Ohio. She had a good job. She lost it because of a cocaine habit. She was convicted of felony breaking and entering. She entered a drug court program. She didn't go to prison. She entered the treatment program, and I was there at the graduation in Youngstown, Ohio, when she hugged the judge and then she turned to the arresting officer and thanked the officer for saving her life. And so I believe the investment in treatment pays off, and I believe the new ideas of drug courts is having great success that we should continue to invest in. As part of this balanced approach, the Drug Enforcement Administration has begun a new initiative called IDEA, Integrated Drug Enforcement Assistance. Its goals is to have law enforcement have a longer-lasting impact. It's to dismantle a criminal organization, but then to have our agents go in and work with the community in terms of treatment, in terms of building the resources in community education. What are the schools doing? Do we have drug tests in the workplaces? What can we do to keep drugs out of the community for a long period of time, giving lasting impact to the enforcement effort? The DEA wants to work side by side with the community on drug awareness and prevention efforts and build treatment programs and community coalitions. We, in accordance with this initiative, we are doubling the number of our demand reduction agents, and we are encouraging 15% of the seized and forfeited assets that traditionally go exclusively to law enforcement to be transferred up to 15% to treatment and education programs. This builds the team concept, reduces the competition between law enforcement and the treatment and education initiatives. And so I don't think that we should debate our drug policy in terms of legalization, but we should debate our drug policy in terms of new ideas from Parent Corps that the President supports and diminishing the treatment gap, providing more treatment resources. Briefly, there was mention in the introduction about the sentencing policy and whether we should have a debate on mandatory minimum sentences. Well, I think, first of all, that we should recognize that mandatory minimum sentences are simply an expression of our society of outrage toward a particular social problem or crime problem that should be addressed. For example, crimes of violence in which guns are used. There's a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years if there is a felony committed with a firearm. I don't see anybody arguing that that mandatory minimum should be reduced because we don't want to tolerate the use of guns to commit violence in our society. Well, whenever it comes to the problem of ecstasy, when it comes to the problem of methamphetamine, there is such an outrage in some of our communities and the devastating impact of crack cocaine that there have been mandatory minimum sentences imposed by our legislatures. What is important is that we recognize that it's an expression of outrage by our society, and secondly, there should be an escape clause that Congress did impose on mandatory minimums so that if there's extraordinary circumstances, the judge can opt out and impose what is perceived to be a fairer sentence considering all of the circumstances. I want to end with a few comments on marijuana. There are some in this conference, perhaps, and in our society that want to legalize marijuana. They want to focus on that and not talk about perhaps heroin and marijuana and cocaine, methamphetamine, but they want to focus on marijuana. They believe that it is less harmful than other drugs. And I think it's very important to be honest with our young people particularly and not paint a picture of marijuana or a specific drug that is not honest and factually based. We shouldn't over-dramatize a particular drug. But at the same time, we should not minimize the impact of a drug that is harmful, such as marijuana. In 1999, more than 200,000 Americans entered substance abuse treatment primarily for marijuana abuse and dependence. Adolescent admissions to substance abuse facilities for marijuana grew from 43% in 1994 to 60% in 1999. I could give you specific instances of it from Dawn, a 17-year-old New Yorker who started smoking marijuana with her friends when she was age 12. She said she did it to relax on weekends, but pretty soon it became an everyday habit. And then she said this, "I learned something one day, and the next day I have no idea what the teacher was talking about." That was the impact of marijuana on her ability to learn and to recall. And so while some people are able to quit marijuana and only use it socially or recreationally, others are not so fortunate and develop serious addiction problems. Marijuana use does have consequences. It may not cause the overdose deaths like heroin or cocaine, but its cumulative effects are just as dangerous. Finally, I believe that Mayor Bloomberg of New York was asked about the statement that he made recently, or during the campaign, the statement that he made. He acknowledged that he had used marijuana in the past. But then he was asked about his policies as mayor of New York, and he said, I'm going to enforce the law. And he said, if you don't enforce the law, you build a contempt for the law in our society. And that's really what the DEA is about. The legislature gives us our mandates, the policies that we enforce, and lest we have contempt for our laws, we enforce those laws. And I do believe it's not just about enforcement, though, it's about the character of a nation. Someone said that a man's character determines his future. Well, I think that is true about a nation as well, that the debate that we have today will say a lot about our nation's future, the direction that we go, and whether we'll handicap our young people in terms of their education, in terms of their productivity, in terms of their leadership in the future. I thank Rice University and James Baker Institute for making sure that we're on the right path in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hutchinson. I am going to keep our introductions quite brief throughout the program. Most of the people here who will be speaking have websites that provide ample information. You have a flyer or an insert that gives you these, so I'm not going to include many amusing anecdotes from their childhood, but just to give you some basic information about the speakers. Kevin Zeese, who will respond to Mr. Hutchinson, is the president of Common Sense for Drug Policy, which is headquartered in Falls Church, Virginia. He's recognized as one of the most knowledgeable and effective spokesmen of a movement that is calling for changes in U.S. drug policy. He's worked on a wide array of programs, issues, including the medical use of marijuana, the militarization of drug enforcement, drug testing, the use of herbicides in drug enforcement, and so on. Happy to have Kevin Zeese to respond to Mr. Hutchinson.
Thanks a lot. First, I want to thank the Ambassador and Professor Rice and the James Baker Institute for holding this conference. This is really a great venue for this, great opportunity for this. And I also want to thank Mr. Hutchinson especially for coming and engaging in the dialogue, because for so long, it's been way too long, in fact, that those who favor the status quo and those who favor reform have not talked to each other. And I think we need to have a dialogue, we need to have a discussion, and I think if we do that, we can find some solutions to this very important problem that affects us now and future generations. And I think this seemingly intractable problem of drug abuse is one that can be solved. I think there's good research that shows what works. I think if we talk to each other and hear from each other, we can really figure out a way to go. And I also appreciate you going around the country, Mr. Hutchinson, and I saw you were in a bookstore in Maryland recently, and even there, medical marijuana patients were asking tough questions, and you mentioned San Francisco, and you're going around the country hearing people dissenting. And I think there is a lot of dissent to the drug war. In fact, a recent Pew poll shows that only about 15% of the public believes the drug war is winnable. Only about 15%. You know what that's equal to? That is equal to the number of people who believe that Elvis Presley is still alive. It's a shrinking minority, and I think it's with good reason people feel that way, because the facts really do not support the success that Mr. Hutchinson sees in the drug war. I'm not going to focus very much on our disagreements. I really am not trying here to defeat Mr. Hutchinson in debate. That's too easy to do, really, when you have the facts, the history, when you have the laws of economics, the laws of supply and demand, and you have common sense on your side. So I'm not trying to defeat him in debate. My goal here is a loftier goal, and that's to engage in a dialogue that can solve this problem. I don't expect we'll solve that today, but I do hope that this is a beginning of a dialogue. And I'm not going to respond to every fact claimed by Mr. Hutchinson. I gave him a copy of our booklet, Drug War Facts, though, so he can go home and study it for our next debate. And I inscribed it very personally for you, so I hope you look at it. But I'm going to start at one place where we do have a disagreement, and that is the question of are we winning the war on drugs? So, see, if we start from the point that we're winning the war on drugs, there's no need to discuss this issue. We're all happy. but the facts are not the way that Mr. Hutchinson sees them. In fact, you rely on just one survey for your claim that we're winning, and that's the household survey. This is conducted by the Department of Health and Human Services. It's a large survey of U.S. households, but it's called the household survey for a reason. There's three things I want to say about it. First, among the households that are not counted are those who are homeless, where you see 50% addiction rates, those who are mentally ill, where we see also similar addiction rates, who were hospitalized, and those who are incarcerated. And so as the incarceration rate of drug users goes up, the percentage of people who are saying they're using illegal drugs will go down. But that doesn't mean that drug use is going down. That just means we're not counting those people. And so we in the United States now have 2 million people behind bars, 500,000 for drug offenses, about 1 million with underlying social substance abuse problems. And so if you add, we have about under 1 million heroin addicts, under 2 million heavy cocaine users. If you add 500,000 people to 1 million people to that group, you suddenly have a whole different picture that Mr. Hutchinson describes. In addition, the household survey is a survey. What happens is a government surveyor comes to your house and asks questions. In fact, surveys show that those who admit their drug use compared to, for example, a drug test result, about 25% underreporting. People don't admit their drug use. And I imagine that's even more true when the government comes to your house and asks you about drug use. So if you're already talking about a 25% differential when someone knows they're going to be drug tested, for example, in a pretrial or bail situation, you find a very big differential. And finally, a lot of people won't even take the survey. In fact, about 20% of those who come forward and are asked about, will you take this survey, 20% refuse to answer the questions. So this household survey is very sketchy. It's not the best reason to claim victory. And I hope that in the future, you'll recognize these shortcomings and not rely on it so heavily. Because if you look at, I think, what's more important and what's more solid, and those are the numbers of people who are harmed by drug abuse or the prices and purity of drugs, much harder numbers, still not perfect, but much harder, you find failure on many levels. For example, if you look at overdose deaths, we are, after spending $500 billion by the federal government from 1980 till today, we are seeing record overdose deaths. Record overdose deaths. That's a solid number, or more solid number, and that's not a sign of victory. We're also seeing record mentions of drugs in emergency rooms. Once again, a more solid number, and after $500 billion, we don't expect to see record mentions of drugs in emergency rooms. We're also seeing rapid spread of HIV and AIDS among the drug-using population. In fact, half the new AIDS cases come from injection drug use. Again, a solid number that does not show victory. And we're also seeing adolescent drug use increase. Now, in adolescent drug use, we don't have as much of a problem with the incarceration issues that kind of make the household survey now as used. We also have the Monitoring the Future survey, which is a survey of high school students. And those show a 50% increase in adolescent drug use since 1990, since before President Clinton. Since the last 2 years of the Bush administration, the previous Bush administration, we began to see adolescent drug use going up. And then finally, look at price and purity of drugs. Now, these numbers come from reports by DEA agents, so we take them with some skepticism. But even so, the price of heroin and cocaine is cheaper today than it was in 1980. The purity of heroin and cocaine is greater than it was in 1980. And drugs like methamphetamine, which had disappeared back in those days, are making a comeback. Drugs like crack that didn't exist in those days now exist. So from 1980 to today, we are not a safer and healthier society. We are not winning the war on drugs. And by the way, it's well past third down. As you pointed out, we've been fighting this drug war now since most of last century. It began at the beginning of last century. And we have 25% of the world's prisoners reside in the United States. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. This is not third down. We're beyond third down. It's time for you to give the ball up and try a new approach. So taking all these facts into account, overdose deaths, emergency room mentions, AIDS, adolescent drug use, price, purity, new drugs, it's awfully hard to say with a straight face that this is victory. We are not safer and healthier. So how do we deal with this? What I want to do with the rest of my time is focus on the areas I think where we have some agreement. I think I want to focus on the areas where we have common goals. My goals as far as trying to develop a successful drug policy are finding policies that reduce the harm to society, that reduce crime, reduce violence, reduce disease, reduce dysfunction, reduce adolescent abuse. Those are my goals. I really don't have the great concern about someone using marijuana privately. It doesn't affect them negatively in a way that hurts society, it doesn't affect society. It's not really my concern. My concern is how drug abuse affects our community's safety and our community's health. And I'm sure you agree with that you're concerned also about the safety and the health of our community. And so if you look at it, if we knew of a policy, for example, that dealt with heroin, one of the more difficult drugs to deal with, a policy that would reduce crime by heroin addicts by 50%, that would decrease homelessness by a third, that would decrease the spread of HIV, that would prevent overdose deaths, that would undermine the drug market. That would be a policy we could all support. And that policy exists. And that policy now is one that's been tried in Switzerland for about a decade. It's been one that's being tried in more and more European and even American countries are looking at it. Countries in the Americas are looking at it. Australia's looking at it, and that is heroin maintenance programs. This is not a prescription model of heroin. This is a clinic model where an addict will go to a clinic, purchase their heroin, not be given it, purchase their heroin, use it at the clinic, and under the eyes of a healthcare worker. And with that kind of approach, Switzerland has seen tremendous success. Massive. This is not coming just from reports these are published peer-reviewed reports. The World Health Organization has looked at this, non-advocate reform, the World Health Organization, they've looked at this, and they've agreed that we've seen a significant reduction in crime, significant disappearing of overdose deaths, a reduction in the drug market, reduction in homelessness, all positives. And yet, I don't hear anyone in the federal government talking about this policy. We have a heroin epidemic in this country, and we're not taking action. We don't even make methadone available. The National Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Medicine, the National Institute of Health, the American Medical Association, all have advocated that methadone be available by doctor prescription filled in a pharmacy. We don't do that in the United States. Something so obvious. In the midst of an epidemic, we could be saving lives with that simple step, and we should be doing, I think, beyond that, a pilot program in some of our cities that would look at the clinic model for heroin. Another example of a policy that's a proven success, that's even less radical, is the question of needle exchange. As I mentioned, half the new AIDS cases come from injection drug use. It's even a larger number. When you look at women and children, it's even higher percentages. And the research is so strong in needle exchange. There's not any debate any longer. Needle exchange does not increase drug use. Needle exchange does not increase the spread of HIV. In fact, reduces HIV by up to 50%. And in fact, it serves as a bridge to treatment. You say you favor treatment? Well, needle exchange serves as a bridge to treatment for many people. The federal government, in fact, the Surgeon General, the Secretary of HHS have both acknowledged needle exchange works. It reduces HIV, does not increase drug use. All the gold standards of American medicine, the National Institute of Health, the National Academy of Sciences, the American Medical Association, all support needle exchange. But the federal government refuses to provide funds so that communities can decide to prevent the spread of AIDS in the most dangerous community, the injection drug-using population. It's time for us to move off of that. It's time for us to get serious about HIV and drug abuse and provide funding for needle exchange. Regarding the most widely used illegal substance, marijuana, marijuana accounts for almost half of all drug arrests. Almost 750,000 drug arrests last year were for marijuana, and most were for possession. And one thing we know about marijuana is that decriminalization works. We know from U.S. experience, and we know from the experience in Holland, and we see the rest of Europe now following a Dutch lead because it's been so successful there. Decriminalization works. The evidence is in. In fact, in 1982, the National Academy of Sciences did a report called An Analysis of Marijuana Policy that reviewed the evidence of marijuana decriminalization in the United States. From 1972 to 1978, 11 states covering one-third of the population decriminalized marijuana possession. So we had a history to look at. And what did we discover from that? What did the National Academy of Sciences find for that? They found that it worked, that there was no increase in marijuana use in those states compared to states that had not decriminalized. And in fact, the National Academy of Sciences recommended that decriminalization become the national policy, and they recommend that we begin to experiment with regulating and taxing the marijuana market. And so marijuana decriminalization is a clear, research-proven, effective method of drug control. In fact, looking back at the last 30 years, I would say that's probably one of the most effective policies we've had. You know, from 1972-78, we had decriminalization, and then from 1978, for the next 10 years, we had reductions in marijuana use. So we reduced the penalty for marijuana possession, and marijuana use went down. Now, I'm not saying that decriminalization caused marijuana use to go down, but by reducing penalty did not result in increased use. So we can reduce the harm of the drug war and reduce marijuana use. History shows it's worked, and we need to look at history. The other area of marijuana that has to be dealt with more effectively is medical use of marijuana. Whatever the debate on marijuana policy generally, we've got to move forward on medical use. It's a shame that we keep hearing this, same thing from the government, more research. When the research comes through, then we'll do something. Well, the fact is, back in the 1988, when the federal government stopped the research on medical marijuana, we were at the final phase of research. There's a three-step process for a drug to be approved in the United States. Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, the FDA goes through. Phase 1 is animal studies, Phase 2 is small population studies, Phase 3 is large population studies. We were in Phase 3, large patient population studies on medical use of marijuana, showing it working, and the federal government closed down the research for the next decade. In 1988, I argued before the chief administrative law judge of the Drug Enforcement Administration. We presented evidence that showed that medical marijuana was safe and effective. And the chief administrative law judge of the DEA gets a paycheck from the Department of Justice every 2 weeks. He ruled that the DEA was being arbitrary and capricious in denying medicine to the seriously ill. But we were shut out of the political process in Washington. We were shut out of the regulatory process. And so we resorted to the political process in the states. There have been initiatives held in states around the country, and consistently the public supports medical marijuana. Why? Because it works. Polling actually shows that people know, that a high percentage of Americans know somebody who has been benefited by medical marijuana. So no matter what the federal government says about it not working, experience shows, in fact, it does work. Before getting to my conclusion, I want to focus on a hot-button issue, which is the use of drugs by kids, adolescent drug abuse. This is an issue that is of concern to everybody. I have two high school and college-age sons, so I have teenage kids of my own, so I'm something I've been personally concerned about. And my view is that, unfortunately, the drug war does more to hurt our kids than protect our kids. It does more to hurt our kids than protect our kids. It's easy for a high school student to buy marijuana than it is for an adult to buy marijuana. It's easy for a high school kid to buy marijuana than it is for them to buy beer. It's easy for a high school kid to buy prescription drugs, to buy cocaine, heroin, ecstasy, LSD, methamphetamine than it is for a high school kid to buy prescription drugs. We have better protection of our kids from prescription drugs and alcohol than we do from the illegal drugs. In addition, unfortunately, we spend our limited money, which is very limited, on drug education, on police officers coming to school to teach about drugs. Those are the wrong messengers with the wrong message. We need to have drugs treated as a health issue. We need health professionals teaching it, not police teaching it. That would be the effective way, but it's not the drug war way when law enforcement dominates. In addition to availability and the purchase, we are seeing our kids trying drugs. In fact, half of our high school students will use an illegal drug before they graduate. And while most of those kids don't get into abusive relationships with those drugs, in fact, only a small percentage of kids, usually in single digits in most years, will use these substances on a regular basis. It is still true that most high school kids will try an illegal drug. And so when we have a zero-tolerance drug education program, half the kids are not going to listen because they've already tried these. They've already broken the zero-tolerance barrier. We need something that works with those kids. In fact, what does work most effectively for preventing abuse is after-school programs for kids. It's at 3 o'clock to 7 o'clock time period. When the kids come home from school, mom and dad are working, or a single parent is working, and that's the time of the heaviest delinquency, heaviest drug abuse, pregnancy, all sorts of issues. After-school programs are most effective. And yet, what's the drug war doing? The drug war is putting up barriers to those effective programs. The great rage and debate now in the drug field is the idea of drug testing kids who want to do extracurricular activities. So put a barrier up So those kids who want to keep busy and active in life can't and get bored and get into trouble. We need to be making those programs more available, not less available. We need to be spending more money in after-school programs. We only spend $600 million on after-school programs nationally. According to the Children's Defense Fund, we should be spending $5 billion a year nationally on after-school programs for kids to meet the needs of the most neediest kids. That would be effective drug policy. That would be effective drug policy, rather than putting up barriers. In fact, when kids get caught or start to get involved in using drugs, rather than denying them services like after-school programs, we should be encouraging them to get involved in after-school programs. So the drug war is doing more harm than good when it comes to our kids. And those are just some of the ways. Finally, another area where we have a common goal, I think, is getting control of the market. The drug market right now, as you pointed out, is out of control. In fact, it's a market that funds all sorts of negative activity, including terrorism, around the globe. But the fact is, there are millions of Americans who spend billions of dollars on all sorts of drugs. We're the heaviest drug-using culture in history. Ritalin for our kids, Prozac, Viagra for our adults, alcohol, tobacco, nicotine, Correctol. It's all out there. And yet, those millions of Americans spending billions of dollars are not funding terrorists. So it's not drugs lead to terrorism. It's drug prohibition leads to terrorism. It is the illegal drug profits. There's that $400 billion, as the UN describes it, market, the slush fund of $400 billion untaxed dollars. That is what leads to any relationship between drugs and terrorism. And once again, I must say, our drug war approach actually makes our problems worse as far as terrorism goes. Take, for example, Colombia. You mentioned Colombia and the FARC. What we do in Colombia primarily in the United States is we spray herbicides. We go through these peasant areas spraying herbicides. We don't just kill coca crops grown in the backyards of these peasants who live on $1 a day. We also kill their food crops. What happens when the helicopter goes through? Who follows behind it? The FARC. That's the group we describe as terrorists. So we give the FARC, our enemy, ammunition to go win the hearts and minds of the peasants. They follow through, and those peasants then have a choice. The FARC comes in and helps them. Well, now we know who our friend is as a peasant. They will get us through the night. The Americans, the Colombian government, they're here to hurt us, and that's the view of the peasant. Or you'll have some who have to be forced off the land and into the cities. And for those people, they go to cities in Colombia where there's 20 to 30% unemployment and add to the social disruption, once again, feeding the terrorism, feeding the social. So once again, our drug war is making the problem worse. And in fact, I'd love for you to point out to me one example of when an interdiction or eradication program has resulted in less drugs in this country. I go back to, for example, in the early days of this, I was befriended by a guy named Ralph Salerno, who was a police officer and police chief in New York City, involved in the French Connection case. And he said that in the 1960s, they were told that if they broke that French Connection, that heroin from Turkey, processed in France, distributed in New York City, that they would break heroin forever. Well, in fact, they broke the French Connection and didn't break heroin forever. We're seeing record overdose deaths today. In fact, what happened was the heroin market moved. It always moves. And you can go through every step. You can go through President Nixon's Operation Intercept on the border with Mexico, trying to stop cars going across the border. That spurred prescription drug use, and then it spurred marijuana and heroin being, rather than brought over the border by cars, used planes and boats, and used commerce. So we added new trafficking routes, and there was a glut of these drugs as a result of Operation Intercept. Then you can go to Jimmy Carter spraying herbicides in Mexico in the 1970s. And what did that result in? That resulted in spurring the U.S. marijuana market. Now marijuana is one of the top crops in many states in the United States, and it spurred the Colombian marijuana market. The Colombian marijuana market then became so big that they were sending bales of marijuana into Florida. And these bales of marijuana, what they do was they flew to Florida, dropped the bales from the plane, and the speedboat would come pick it up, bring it to shore. Sometimes there were so many bales coming in, they would wash up on shore. Square grouper, the people called it in Florida. And they had a party on the beach with this square grouper that washed up on shore. There was so much marijuana. And so what happened, President Reagan saw this problem in the 1980s, and he brought in the military. The military was great at catching these big bales of slow-moving marijuana. But what did that mean? That meant that the Colombians switched to cocaine. And not surprisingly, we had a cocaine glut in the United States, leading toward crack and the whole 1980s problem of cocaine. And you can go on. And I think with the Colombian problem, unfortunately, not only are you helping terrorists, but you're spurring the methamphetamine. If you are successful in Colombia, which of course I have doubts about, but if you're successful in Colombia in reducing cocaine use, what will take its place? Methamphetamine. It's cheaper, produced domestically, no borders to cross, and it's more dangerous. And so now we can have in the next decade a methamphetamine explosion, and we can all blame it on the terrible drug users, when in fact the drug war is spurring that. So the reality is, we're kind of like in the situation of the old doctors who bled their patients. They didn't know how to deal with some illnesses, and so they bled their patients. And what happened? Patients bled to death. Well, we're drug warring ourselves to death. And I really am sincere when I tell you that I really want to find a new way. Prohibition is a 1800s concept. It was at a time when we had choice of illegal or legal. We didn't have the food, for example, in the 1880s, there was no Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Once that act got put in place, we solved a lot of the opiate-based problems that you talk about from the 1880s. But now we have, in the 21st century, we've developed administrative law, regulatory approaches, tax law, all sorts of ways to control dangerous activities. We don't have to rely on brute force. And brute force, in fact, has not worked. So it's time to put the 1800s behind us and move to the 21st century, come up with some new solutions. And for some drugs, that may mean a regulated market like alcohol, perhaps with more restrictions on advertising and where it can be sold. For other drugs, it may mean a prescription model, but I hope we can find actually a third way. And I really hope to engage you in an ongoing dialogue about this, because I really appreciate you coming forward and participating in this discussion. For too long, we've let this problem get worse. We've been divided by the legalizers and the drug warriors, and that really doesn't get us anywhere. And as a culture, this is too important an issue. This is too important an issue for us to keep doing the same thing over and over again. I'm confident that the United States is better than just repeating the same mistake, the same century-old mistake, over and over again. And I hope today is the beginning of the end of the war on drugs. Thank you all very much.
Really interesting about your time. Thank you, Kevin. And first of all, we'd like to give these gentlemen the time that they would like to have to talk to each other. And we have plenty of questions if you run out of things you agree or disagree on. But you can engage in conversation with each other when you like to.
Why don't you respond a little bit, I guess.
I'll just try to do this from here and keep this a little bit informal. In listening to the presentation, I made one there. In summary, I think there was a disagreement in the underlying facts as to the progress that was made. The household survey, even if you disagree with the statistical model, it's been a consistent pattern of measuring progress that we've made for the last 20 or 30 years, and it mirrors the household survey. Mirrors also some of the other surveys that are done. I don't know of any survey that does not reflect the same basic statistical model that we had progress when we concentrated on it as a nation from 82 to 92, and that we flatlined since then. And then beyond that particular point of issue, there were a number of directions that my colleague here, Kevin, advocated. One was heroin maintenance programs, secondly, needle exchange, decriminalization of marijuana, medical use of marijuana, concern about teenage use of it and reducing it, and then a great concern over our approach in Colombia. In reference to the heroin maintenance programs, statistics are difficult to deal with. I think it's fair to say the verdict is out in Europe. But in a previous British experiment with heroin maintenance programs, after a try of that, they abandoned that approach because it led to a 100% increase in heroin use. And that was one experiment that was on the heroin maintenance program. In reference to the medical use of marijuana, and maybe we can have a discussion on this, Kevin, but you said the federal government stopped research. I just authorized a research, and the DEA has to authorize research for any academic or scientific community to use marijuana for testing its medical benefits or harm. I think it's, I have a consistent position, I hope I have a consistent position, that we ought to listen to science and medicine when it comes to whether marijuana or any other substance has a medical benefit. Thus far, they have said the answer is no. But to be consistent, we want to continue the research on it, and so I've authorized the University of San Diego to test and to experiment with human beings smoking marijuana to see if there is any health benefit that comes from that overrides the adverse health consequences. Are we talking about the same thing there?
Yeah, I'd be happy to respond to you on that. I also like to, I'm not going to get into the British thing, but I think you have the history wrong. But I'm going to focus on medical marijuana since we can't deal with everything all at once here today. On medical marijuana, in 1988, in fact, research was stopped. And it was only recently, after a series of political successes by the reform movement, that the federal government once again got into allowing research. But unfortunately, you're going backwards. When we stopped the research in 1988, we were at the final phase. We were in phase 3 of the, if you get, as I said, I gave you Drug War Facts. If you visit Drug War Facts, look at the medical marijuana page on our website. I'll link you to a review of that research. If we're going to do research, let's start from what we already know. We already know it works for a large numbers of patients, and let's start from phase 3. Let's not from phase 1 again.
Are we in agreement, though? Because I understood that you said the federal government stopped research. Are we in agreement that the research is ongoing at the present time of any health benefits for smoking marijuana in human beings?
It just started again, and unfortunately, they're starting behind the times rather than starting what we already know. You're going backwards. So I would prefer you start. Let's get back to phase 3 and get this over with, rather than redo a bunch of research we already know. On the medical marijuana issue, the call for research. As you know, General McCaffrey spent $1 million on the Institute of Medicine doing a review of medical marijuana. In fact, they did say that medical marijuana should be allowed for some patients. They encouraged more research, but they did recognize that medical marijuana did work for some people and should be available for some patients now. And so if you want to follow research, let's follow research. And as I said, where's the research that shows that the Colombian drug war is going to work? We're going full-blown into a program that has failed and failed every other time we've tried it. Please point out one success in 30 years of an eradication program that has stopped drugs from coming to this country. Point out one success, because I've reviewed that research and there is none.
I'd be happy to.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, in Bolivia.
Yeah, go ahead.
In Bolivia, they've had a very, very successful eradication program. President Quiroga has led that effort. They have reduced almost the Bolivian coca production down to zero.
And so there's less cocaine in the United States?
And you asked the success of eradication program.
No, I've asked successful program that reduced the supply of drugs to the United States. There's none. As a result, Bolivia, and they're still fighting in Bolivia. In fact, there's strikes with the coca growers. There's all sorts of unrest about that Bolivian coca program. But since the Bolivia effort, we actually have more cocaine in this country. We made the problem worse by going into Bolivia.
Well, we certainly disagree on that. I think Bolivia is an indication of how a country can reclaim their geography from the coca growers and from the drug traffickers. Certainly there was a shift into Colombia, and that illustrates the fact that we have to have success not just in Bolivia but in Colombia as well.
And if it doesn't work success in Colombia, then it goes further in the Amazon, goes to Venezuela, goes to Brazil, goes to Peru. There's so many places in the world where this can move to and has moved to, that all you're doing is chasing your tail. And the problem keeps getting worse in the United States.
We'd be happy to respond to questions from the audience.
Okay, sure. All right. There are, a number of the questions have to do with medical marijuana, with the Institute of Medicine's report, some of these, and I think you have already responded to these. See if there's anything else here. Oh, here's one, and I take it that this is accurate. I'm not sure about this. Said you acknowledged on the O'Reilly Forum TV show that decisions about viable medicine, including medical marijuana, should be made by medical doctors instead of police officers, and that the decision about how various substances are scheduled should be made by the Surgeon General instead of the head of the DEA. will you delegate that? Is that accurate? And will you delegate this decision to from your office to the Surgeon General? I have no opinion on the accuracy of that statement.
Well, I don't believe I said we ought to delegate it to doctors. Historically, it has been the medical community, the scientific community as a whole that has determined what is good medicine or not. And we had a very structured FDA approval process. If there's a new medicine that comes on the market, it is studied, it is researched, the Food and Drug Administration reviews it and makes a determination, and that's been the process that's been followed. I think we ought to stick with that process, whether it is a new drug that Purdue Pharma or other pharmaceutical industry produces, or whether it is something like marijuana. And I think the Institute of Medicine, there were some statements in the Institute of Medicine study that there was some indications of a health benefit from smoking marijuana. But the other part of it was that it was outweighed by the harm that comes from smoking marijuana. That was the conclusion. In fact, there's more carcinogens that you get from smoking 5 joints a week versus as much as 5 joints a week compared to 1 pack of cigarettes a day. And so the carcinogens, they say that outweighs any potential health benefit because it could be delivered through another means. There's other medication that would help in reference to pain, including Marinol, that can be utilized. But that's going to continue to be studied.
Okay, thank you. Will the administration support or oppose a bill now in Congress to pull federal enforcement away when it conflicts with state law, or as in the use of medical marijuana? But I presume that could be in other state laws as well.
No. I mean, my responsibility is to enforce federal law in accordance with good law enforcement practice. And if some state decides that you ought to legalize pharmacy robberies, it's still a violation of federal law. We're going to enforce federal law. And that's sort of an extreme example, but my responsibility is to enforce federal law. And obviously, when it comes to marijuana, the target of federal enforcement activities is the drug trafficking organizations. It's not the users that are out there. It is the organizations that transport the drugs that we are targeting.
Unfortunately, these drug trafficking organizations are also seen as medical marijuana dispensaries, community-based dispensaries that are supported by the local government as well as the local voters and local doctors. And so it does create a conflict. I understand the need for the DEA to enforce what they see as their mandate, but I would hope that they would make this less of a priority at a time when we're seeing record overdose deaths from more serious drugs. I'd hope that medical marijuana would be a much less priority. And on the previous question, I just want to make one brief comment. One of the unfortunate things about the way our laws are set up, particularly the Controlled Substances Act, is that the DEA decides what drugs get scheduled and where they get scheduled, not the Department of Health and Human Services. And that's an unfortunate part of our law, one of the compromises of the Controlled Substances Act, and that I think is one reason why we're in trouble. In fact, the DEA not only has the power to schedule, they have the power to schedule new drugs without legislatures telling them to do so. They can make drugs illegal. In fact, the first drug that was true was ecstasy. Back in the mid-1980s, 1986, ecstasy before that was legal.
Was that a bad decision that we did?
I'll tell you, it was a very bad decision.
Ecstasy should be scheduled?
I'll be happy to explain why it was a bad decision if you'll let me. Prior to 1986, ecstasy was being used in therapeutic purposes. But as the DEA moved to making ecstasy illegal, that drew a great deal of press attention. In fact, Time magazine did a cover story on it, the love drug, the drug that makes you hug and love, incredible advertising. And as a result of that prohibition effort and that attention, I think you actually spurred the ecstasy problem. You actually made the ecstasy problem worse, and you continue to make the ecstasy problem worse when agents down in New Orleans, where they're trying to close down clubs that are involved in raves where ecstasy is being used, are urging no water be made available and are urging all sorts of other steps that could actually make the problem safer. The biggest problem with ecstasy is that we don't know, in most markets, we don't know what people are using. It's the most adulterated drug out there, and that causes a great deal of problem. The other big problem with ecstasy is it's underground, and as a result, health officials can't minimize the risk. We have created a situation of maximum harm.
Well, I just want to make sure I understand your point here, because we have different schedules. We have Schedule 1 on a controlled substance,
Right.
which is any product that has no medical benefit. And ecstasy would be in that category because there would be no medical benefit. Are you simply saying that it should be a Schedule 2 instead of a Schedule 1?
Well, that would be an improvement, and that's also true for marijuana. The difference between a Schedule
So
1...
you believe that ecstasy has a medical benefit?
It was showing medical benefits prior to it being a Schedule 1 drug. And that, unfortunately, again, there's no research that we can...
But in any context, it is regulated. It is something that we're trying to keep off the streets. How would it help our young people not to have access to ecstasy if it was put in a form that was not strictly illegal?
The key point I was trying to make with the ecstasy example was that in 1986, ecstasy was almost a non-problem. And here we are 15 years later, after the first drug made illegal by the DEA, not by the legislature, made illegal by the DEA, expanding their authority. The first 15 years later, now we have a big ecstasy problem.
So it's our fault?
Prohibition does not work. It's a great case study of prohibition's failures.
Let me come to another question here. This is for Mr. Hutchison. You had noted that we had 4 million fewer users than 15 years ago. The question that it's asked in a couple of different ways is, how can you be sure that U.S. policy and not something like less demand accounted for the change, or that information such as has lowered the use of cigarettes, which are still legal, but education and information about cigarettes has lowered that, and perhaps that instead of the policy? Although policy is involved, of course, in the way we treat cigarettes.
Well, I mean, I think education certainly had a huge factor in reducing the drug usage during that 15-year time frame. I think that there was a combination of factors when it comes to cocaine, from the tough sentencing, but also the extraordinary public outcry over the damage that it was doing. And I think all of that had an impact. But education is part of the policy. The policy during that time was the intangible of national leadership. It was tough sentencing and enforcement, as well as education programs during that time. And probably, I always have hats off to the education arena. I think it has the biggest impact. But you can't really have an educated society on the harm of drugs unless you have an enforcement aspect to it as well. Someone said not very many people just to voluntarily walk into a treatment program. It's usually an arrest that triggers that.
Well, unfortunately, the point of the question was that our education policy with tobacco worked without herbicide spraying in North Carolina, without mass arrests, without zero tolerance programs in our schools, denying kids programs. We succeeded in fact, the last couple of years, we've seen about a 5% reduction in tobacco use among adolescents without all of that. So maybe, in fact, you don't need the enforcement as much as you think you do. And maybe, in fact, the key is to have an honest education system that's not part of a drug war environment that, in fact, I think undercuts the educational message, because it becomes propaganda rather than information.
Okay. Mr. Hutchison has been very gracious to give us as much time as he has, and he does have to leave for other things today. One question I'd like to, and I think a number of people have asked this, is can you see, sir, what sorts of middle ground, or perhaps not middle, but in between ground at some point, that various people, where do you see the best avenues for people to work, who have differing views, to work together on what we all acknowledge is a very serious issue, or set of issues? Oh,
I think there's some very clear things that we have agreement on. One of them is the importance of education programs. Kevin made the point that, well, maybe it shouldn't all be law enforcement officers, and I certainly agree with that. I think that there's a lot of different people that can have a role in it working in our schools. My view is anybody who wants to volunteer and has got a good background, whether it's the health professionals or whether it's somebody in law enforcement, can have an impact on young people. So we're in agreement on education. We're in agreement on the increased need for treatment. The President wants to close that treatment gap, is investing more in treatment, and is really providing leadership. I believe that drug courts is a good avenue for that. So I think the education, the treatment arena, where we disagree is in terms of the role that law enforcement plays, and whether we should keep it in a criminalized context.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We really do appreciate your being here with us. Great contribution. If you wanted to ask Mr. Z some more questions, we've got a little more time here for that.
No,
But,
it needs to be a defined debate that we're having. I'm sure we're answering questions. What we're doing. I didn't mean to create any fence.
Okay.
This is the spot?
Okay. Platform holds up. We have a picture. Thank you.
Are there other questions that you would, we could either take a little bit of a break here, or we have other questions for Mr. Zeese? Yes. David. What? Wait,
We're going to take all the questions written.
oh, that's right. Okay, for this.
If you want to tell him the question, he can reiterate it over the same.
All right, we'll take all the questions written here. I've got plenty more questions here. A number of them were for Mr. Hutchinson. So let's see.
Too bad there's not a mic you could go to. Is there a mic you could go to?
Well, Kevin, let's come back to the question that we just asked you, and it was addressed to both speakers as well. What do you see as the opportunities for middle ground?
I think the key for finding a middle ground is for us to more clearly define our goals. I think it's unrealistic to have a drug-free society. If that's going to be our goal, it's going to be very hard to find a middle ground. If instead we're going to try to reduce the damage that drugs and the drug war does to our communities, then we can begin to find middle ground positions. And I think once we do that, we then face the question of, is drug abuse really a law enforcement problem, or is drug abuse really a public health problem with social and economic consequences? Once we realize that drug abuse is a public health problem with social and economic consequences, then I think the middle ground becomes obvious. They're in public health solutions. They're in treatment, making treatment available like any other health service. One thing Mr. Hutchinson said was no one volunteers for treatment. Well, those who try to volunteer for treatment can't get it. It's only those who are coerced into treatment that seem to have an easy time getting into it, whether they want it or not. And so I think making treatment more available like a health service is a first step. I think we can agree a lot on the adolescent issues, the importance of prevention there and education there, but we have to, I think, recognize also the negative consequences of the drug war, bringing the drug war into our schools. So I think the key starting with the goals being more clear. We can't have a drug-free society, but we can have a society with a lot less drug problems.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. I think we covered most of the questions that we had here. I think I recommend that what we do is to go ahead and start on the next session, and go ahead and we have such a tight schedule anyway, so we'll just go ahead and if Judge Gray, well, I will just introduce Judge Gray and the District Attorney from Ronnie Earl from Austin. Yeah. Thank you. Surely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Kevin. As we have already seen, one of the most controversial areas in the war on drugs is the criminalization, what happens in the criminal court system. Each year, hundreds of thousands of American citizens are arrested and incarcerated for drug offenses. As I indicated in my introductory remarks, and as has been reiterated here, a number of political leaders have called for alternatives to this, to see that we can't just imprison our way out of the drug problem. This is an important legal issue, but it's not the only one. And to discuss a range of these, we have invited a judge and a district attorney to talk about these issues from their perspective. We had invited Dr. Joe McNamara of the Hoover Institution at Stanford to discuss these issues from his perspective as a former police chief, but unfortunately, due to some miscommunication, he's unable to be with us. But I do hope he'll make a contribution to the final report for this conference. Judge James Gray is a veteran judge of the Superior Court in Orange County, California. He's a former federal prosecutor in Los Angeles and a criminal defense attorney with the Navy JAG Corps. He's the co-author of an important book, Why Our Drug Laws Have Failed and What We Can Do About It, which is a thoughtful book that includes back cover praise from Walter Cronkite, Milton Friedman, George Shultz. Judge Gray has appeared on more than 100 radio and television programs as well as a number of forums nationwide discussing these issues, and it's a pleasure to have him with us here today to talk about his perspective as a judge.
Well, good morning. I, too, want to go overboard, if I can, to thank the Ambassador, thank Dr. Martin, and certainly thank Secretary Baker for this opportunity. It is critically important that we discuss these issues. Let me share with you, maybe even personally, some of my background on this and what led me to this microphone this morning. Yes, my name is James P. Gray, and I am a former drug warrior. I was a criminal defense attorney in Navy JAG, representing people in the military charged with mostly small drug transactions. And then I was a federal prosecutor in the United States Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, and I believed in what I was doing. Well, maybe not necessarily believed in it, but I certainly accepted it, didn't give it much thought. It just seemed like the logical thing to do, because I equated these sometimes dangerous, sometimes addicting drugs with prison. In fact, I think we were all pretty much raised that way, to equate heroin, for example, with prison. It's kind of like being against sin. We are against sin. We know that intuitively. But what we want to do is to take steps to reduce that type of behavior. And so, I held the record for the largest drug prosecution in the Central District of California, which is about the 5 central counties in Los Angeles, for a short period of time in 1978, which is exactly the time period that Mr. Hutchinson was talking about, when drug usage was so rampant and has been decreased since then. It was 75 kilos of heroin, 160 pounds, which was and is a lot of heroin. Does anyone have any idea what the record prosecution today is in the Central District of California with regard to narcotics prosecutions? 18 tons of cocaine in one transaction. When I was a prosecutor, the wholesale price of a kilo of heroin or cocaine was about $25,000, and that's, of course, not talking about inflation. Today, it's about half that. It's about $12,000 to $13,000, so the price is half. When I was a prosecutor, the quality, the purity level of this wholesale cocaine, heroin, was about 20%. Today, it's about 80%. So you come into a situation in which the cost is half, the strength is 4 times, and the amount is simply out of the roof. So I started asking myself the question that I ask of you. How many people here feel that we in the United States of America are in better shape today than we were just 5 years ago with regard to the critical issue of drug use and abuse and all of the crime and misery that goes with it? Again, just for clarity, how many of you people here feel that we in our great country are in better shape today than we were 5 years ago with regard to this critical issue of drug use and abuse and all of the crime and misery that goes with it? And I see no hands, which is completely consistent with every other group that I speak with. And it doesn't matter which group. It could be a religious organization, a Rotary Club, a Chamber of Commerce, a political action group. In fact, I can tell you I'm probably the only person that I know of that can make this statement. I have received basically a standing ovation from giving basically the same talk, both to the ACLU on the one hand and the Young Republicans of Orange County on the other. This crosses all political boundaries. And so I decided within myself that no, it is not a question of our drug laws failing. It isn't even a question that our drug laws have failed, although, yes, Dr. Martin, that was the title of my book. It really is a question that the situation under our present policy of drug prohibition is hopeless. It is hopeless. It will never get better. Literally, victory today is being defined as slowing down the pace of defeat. That is my position. It is not third down. In fact, it isn't even fourth down. This ball has changed possession to the degree that this game is over. It will never get better. So let's understand, though, from the outset, two fundamental things. One is critically important, that people understand it is not the fault of law enforcement that we're in this position. We are not pointing the finger at law enforcement saying you failed us, because it is the system itself. It is the same thing to point the finger at law enforcement today saying you failed to cure this war on drugs problem or drug prohibition would be the same thing at blaming Elliot Ness for the failure of alcohol prohibition. It's not their fault. It is the system that has done it. Secondly, equally importantly, we must understand that everyone in this room, and really all people in the nation, except for the drug lords, are on the same side of this issue. We all want to reduce drug use and abuse and all of the crime and misery that goes with it. The question where we may differ is how best to accomplish that goal, but that is the common ground. That is what we are all attempting to do. So let's stop shouting at each other, let's stop calling each other names, and get on with that business. So I finally decided, who better to be able to communicate a message of this kind than someone like me? I'm a pretty tough dude, actually. I'm a pretty conservative person, pretty clean cut. Maybe my hair is a little longer now than it should be, but I've never used any of this stuff before, never going to. You can make cocaine available on every street corner, bless it by the Pope, and I'm damned if I'm going to jam cocaine up my nose. I'm not going to do it. And I don't think you are either. So let's recognize then that we are all on the same side of this issue, and I felt that if I would speak publicly about this issue, that people would have to listen to the message, and by and large, that is what's happened. But I got to tell you, to get a little personal, it was a scary thought. I didn't know what the response would be. But I can also tell you, just like everyone in this room, I love my country. I hate these drugs so much. I hate so much what the presence of these drugs in our communities can and does do to people, and I see it all the time in my courtroom, that I want to do what I can to reduce that misery, that harm, that crime, that disease, that danger. And so I told myself, this is a time in which I can do something significant for my country. So I told myself, all right, Jim, don't be afraid. It's okay. It's the right thing to do. So I held that press conference, and I've been speaking as publicly as I can ever since. What do you talk about? Well, Dr. Martin was very charitable in his introduction. I can tell you, I remember one introduction that was not quite as charitable, a lot shorter. In fact, I can remember it verbatim. It was on the order of, I know you all want to hear the latest dope from the courthouse, so here's Judge Gray. But there are lots of things to talk about. What we fundamentally need to do is to open up the discussion. We need to communicate to all of our people, our taxpayers, and our voters one simple thing. In fact, as soon as we communicate that message, we will change away from this failed system. And that message is, it's okay to talk about drug policy. Just because we discuss drug policy does not mean that we condone drug use or abuse. If we get that one point across, the whole shooting match is over, because like Kevin Zeese was saying, and like many more people will say today and tomorrow, there are so many harms that we are unnecessarily inflicting upon ourselves because of drug prohibition, that every major survey, every major neutral survey in our country, as well as in Canada and Great Britain in the last 100 years, has recommended that we go away from the criminal justice approach because of all of the harms that we're inflicting upon ourselves. We need just that open, honest, thorough discussion. So all we need to do then is to tell our people, don't be afraid. It's okay. It's the right thing to do. What are the harms that I have seen? I've been a judge now for 18 years. What are the harms that I have seen us inflict unnecessarily upon our people? Kevin was right. The United States of America leads the world in the incarceration of our people. We have more people incarcerated in the United States of America, both by sheer numbers as well as per capita, as any other country in the world. Here, we're number one does not make me proud. We have more people incarcerated per capita than South Africa during the height of apartheid, more than the Soviet Union when it was in vogue. There's got to be something wrong here. What else? We have in California, where I'm from, talk about 3 strikes and you're out. This is a statistic that curdles my blood. We have 4 times more people incarcerated right this minute, serving a 25 years to life sentence for a marijuana violation than for robbery, rape, and murder combined. We have thousands, in fact, we have tens of thousands of people in prison in California right this minute because they did nothing but smoke marijuana. That is not a statistic that you will hear from him, but it's true. You know how? Because people are sent to prison for whatever reason, and then at a certain time they're put on parole. Do you know as well as I do what one of the terms of parole is? That you not use any form of illicit substance. And if they smoke marijuana, they're hooked and they're sent back to prison. Either they don't go and get their urine test. If they fail to show for the urine test, that's a violation and they're sent back to prison. Or if they do, marijuana stays in your system for upwards of 30 days. So if they have smoked marijuana within the last month, they're sent back to prison, and we have thousands of those people in prison for just that reason. In fact, you talk about supply and demand, incentives, and you fail to realize what we're doing by this present system. Because the message is to our felons on parole, as well as everyone else in society that's concerned about drug testing and losing their jobs, and certainly to our children, the message fundamentally is, if you're worried about being caught, take cocaine, don't take marijuana. Why? Because cocaine will stay in your system for about 72 hours. The marijuana will stay in your system to be detectable by your analysis for about 28 to 30 days. That is not the message we want to send, but that message is being received. There are cardinal rules of prohibition. You would think that we would have remembered and learned those rules during alcohol prohibitionary times, because we're still living in prohibition today. It's drug prohibition with the same results. But just analyze this. We understand that college students are beer drinkers, basically. Right? I think that you may remember that. What happens when they go to a football game? It's prohibited to bring in alcohol into the football stadium, right? What happens? They're converted to whiskey drinkers, right? Easier to conceal, stronger stuff. Same rule during alcohol prohibition. Do you know what happened? You, as a bootlegger, would run the same risk for a barrel of beer as a barrel of whiskey. So which would you push? Easy, whiskey. And we turned a nation from beer drinkers more into whiskey drinkers. We're doing the same thing today with regard to pushing a lot of people who, rightly or wrongly, are using marijuana as their drug of choice, and we're pushing them up the scale. That is not what we want to do. So there's so many things to talk about. Are the drugs available today? I talked to you about when I was a prosecutor as opposed to today. 80% strength, half the price and the availability. We can't keep drugs out of prison, folks. We cannot. How do we expect to keep drugs off the streets of here in Houston if we can't even keep them out of our prisons? So it's not a question of condoning this. It's a question of realizing that forever, ever since mankind has walked the face of the earth, we have had some form of mind-altering, sometimes addicting drug present in our communities. We always have, and we always will. So if that's the case, and it is, let's try to take every step we reasonably can to reduce the harm that can and will be caused from them. Fundamentally, we cannot stop people from selling small amounts of drugs for large amounts of money. That is a cardinal rule of human behavior. The other one is the law of supply and demand. If the demand is here, Mr. Hutchinson, the demand will be met. And here we are talking about reinforcing all of those programs that have been proved not to work, and we're talking about strengthening them. Talk about poor Columbia? Come on, what is really happening? What is really the facts here? You could bulldoze Colombia, Mr. Hutchinson. You could obliterate, take it off the face of the world. Take Bolivia, take Peru along with it. And you know what? It won't make the slightest bit of difference with regard to our drug problem here. Why? Because if the demand is here, the demand will be met. And if it isn't met in Peru and Colombia and Ecuador, it will be met in Nigeria or Burma or Afghanistan or California. Do you know, folks, what the largest cash crop is in the state of California today? Marijuana. Number 2 is corn. Why? Because if the demand is here, the demand will be met. And then we in the United States of America are so arrogant, and that's the word for it, arrogant, in deciding whether or not we will certify other countries as working hard enough to help us with our drug problems. That is a brash, arrogant thing to do, and we're hated for it. Whether we're going to certify Mexico, whether we're going to certify the government of Colombia, let's talk facts here. Should we certify the government of California because marijuana is the largest cash crop in its state? We should decertify that government, shouldn't we? To be consistent, but don't look for consistency in this area. And then, fundamentally, I know that people in our country are prepared to swallow some problems. Swallow the problems in Colombia, swallow the fact even that we have lost more of our civil liberties because of the war on drugs than anything in the history of our country. That's a hard swallow, folks. In fact, I have a chapter in my book that I called The Erosion of Civil Liberties. If I were to write that chapter again, the subtitle would be, Where's Paul Revere? Who is spreading the alarm? It's so easy to give away our rights and so almost impossible to get them back. But we do all of this, and I think some of us would do it knowingly, if it would protect our children, if it would stave these drugs and the drug issues away from our children. I think we would be prepared to swallow these things. The problem is the reverse. The problem is our policy of drug prohibition is affirmatively putting our children in harm's way, at least for 4 reasons. Number 1, as they discussed earlier, it is easier for our children to get illegal drugs than it is a 6-pack of beer. Now, all right, I was under 21 for a while. Maybe some of you people were too, and you knew that you can get alcohol, right? Okay, all right, we know that. But it takes a little ingenuity, takes a little effort. The illegal drugs find our children. You might say, oh, a drug lord doesn't care if my 16-year-old daughter uses cocaine, but that's not true. He does care. He wants her to because he makes money at it. When was the last time anyone ever heard of someone offering a free sample of alcohol on a high school campus? And the answer is it does not happen. Why? No money in it. Regulations, lose your license, sanctions from the government. When was the last time you heard of anyone offering a free sample of marijuana or cocaine on a high school campus? And the answer is it happens all the time. Why? Same reason. Because somebody else has a vested economic interest to get our children hooked. That is a result of drug prohibition. Number 2, we all want our kids, particularly during the summertime when they're away from school, to what? Stay home and play Nintendo and sleep late? Not a chance. We want them to get a job, right? So we chase them off to entry-level positions, which is a great thing. Learn the value of the dollar. Do you know what happens during the summertime? Frequently they will be off in some form of party or other, and they'll meet somebody that's their contemporary who sells drugs. So the discussion comes up, hey, you're working, aren't you? Yeah. Where are you working? Oh, I'm working bagging groceries or at a car wash or whatever I'm doing. Oh, yeah? How much money did you make last week? Well, I made $150. $150? Boy, are you a sucker. You know, I can earn 4 times that much money in an afternoon selling drugs. And he's right. And everybody knows that he's right. And we are undercutting the work ethic of our children in a disastrous way. We might as well take out billboards telling our kids, are you interested in making big money? There's no way you can ever do it except by selling drugs. And this is a harmful thing caused by drug prohibition. Number 3, what happens? I see this all the time in our court system. We talk about getting tough, right? Increasing the penalties. It's what we always do. You know what happens when we increase the penalties for adults, mandatory minimums and the rest for drug transactions? They go out and recruit children because everyone and their half-sister, including the children, juveniles, know that we treat our juveniles less strongly less severely in the juvenile court system than we do adults in the adult court system. And I agree with that. I think it's a good idea. But the kids know it too. So ask yourself this question: how much risk-taking can you buy for $100 in cash to a 16-year-old boy in the inner city or almost anywhere else? And the answer is quite a bit. So the adults go out and recruit children to be involved in drug markets. They'll pay them, say, $100 in cash, which is chump change for a drug dealer, a lot of money for a kid. And they find, with a little bit of threats of violence, which they do, and this chump change, they have somebody that's pretty reliable. So they'll use them as gophers. They'll use them as lookouts. They'll use them even as drug couriers. And then you know what happens? As night follows day, as soon as the reliability of these youngsters is established, the adults trust them to go out and sell small amounts of drugs for larger amounts of money, both the kids and themselves. Happens all the time. Ask yourself this final clinching question: who does a 16-year-old boy or girl in the inner city sell drugs to? Us? No. He and she will sell drugs to their 15, 16, 17-year-old peers. And that recruits more young people into a lifestyle of drug usage and drug selling because of the money, because of our laws of drug prohibition. I see this. The evidence is in, folks, and we are really suffering as a result of that. And to carry that story out a little farther, say a year or two from now, this first fellow, if he's still alive, because I got to tell you, drug selling is a dangerous business. He'll probably start carrying a gun, others do too, and the rest, but he certainly will start using drugs. It's available, it's free swinging and the rest. If he's still alive, his life is probably a wreck. But don't worry, because now his recruits are carrying on his business, and it continues on in this fashion. Come to juvenile court. You'll see the results of this policy. Number 4. Remember, number 1, it's easier for kids to get drugs than the illegal drugs than the alcohol. Number 2, the work ethic. Number 3, we are recruiting our children to this lifestyle. Number 4, how many of you remember this very gifted basketball player, Len Bias? Anybody? Yeah. University of Maryland, wonderful, wonderful basketball player. And as the story goes, he was celebrating at night because he had been drafted number 1 by the Boston Celtics. Wouldn't you? You know, his financial future is secure. So he took cocaine for the first time in his life, had an allergic reaction, and died. You know what we did as a result of that? Oh, made all the papers, just all of this recrimination. How can we allow this to happen? What did Washington do? Same thing as they always do. They increased the drug mandatory minimum sentences. You know what the real story is of Len Bias? Len Bias was on his 3rd convulsion before it's hard to call them friends, people around him sought medical attention for him, and by the time they did, it was too late and he died. Why would they wait? They could see he was in distress. Why would they wait? Easy. Because they were concerned about his legal health and they were concerned about their own legal health. So they delayed that critical time period until he died. I represent to you that if we had a different system, that he would still be likely living today. We're close to Plano, Texas here, as I understand it. You know where that is, I anticipate. I understand it is a fairly affluent suburb of Dallas. As I understand it, the same problem happened in Plano, Texas. A couple of years ago, something on the order of 18 teenagers overdosed and died for various reasons because they had taken narcotics of some form, had an allergic reaction, the pollutants in it or whatever else, and all of them had people, contemporaries that were around them, and in every case, the people waited until it was too late and they died. A friend of mine, his name is Mike Gray, he's not a relation to me, he's written a book also, it's called Drug Crazy. It's a good book, it's not as good as mine, but it's a very good book. He was so concerned that he went to Plano, Texas, and he told me, in fact, he testified before a commission that I was on, what happened. Because he was so concerned, he went to Plano, Texas, talked with the powers that be down there, including the chief of police and those sorts of elected officials, and said, look, can you see what's going on here? Can you see that it is our laws that are resulting in the deaths of our children? Why don't we change an ordinance to allow people to take others in medical distress, including themselves, to get medical help without any repercussions? No questions will be asked and no repercussions. And you know what the city fathers there said? No. Why? It's that same tired and totally false last chance reason that everybody always gives. If we were to do that, we would be sending the wrong message to our children. That is fundamentally the only rationale that people use to justify this terrible, failed system that we have. But let me ask you this question. What's the right question? Because the question, the answer that we're giving to our children now is, if you use drugs, go ahead and die. Your life is not worth saving. And I swear to you that that is not the message that we believe or the message that we want to give to our children. So we are fighting several things here that are transparently unable to be fought. We cannot repeal the law of supply and demand. I wish people in Washington had taken Accounting 1A. If you would understand the law of supply and demand, you would realize that it cannot be repealed. I wish that people would simply be able to legitimize this discussion. And we need to tell them that, look, don't be afraid. It's okay. It's the sensible thing to do. We need to get involved in research. Scratching the surface here a little bit, we were really doing well in the United States of America for years. Shreveport, Louisiana, had a marvelous program, kind of like a drug maintenance program that is going on in Switzerland today, and we're going to hear about this tomorrow. This has marvelous promise. In fact, it's not hopeful. It's actually being used now very successfully. This comment that the increased drug usage by 100% is flat out wrong. Flat out untrue. It has done the reverse. And we'll hear about this tomorrow, and please come and please listen to this drug maintenance program that's going on in Switzerland today. It will bring you hope. Maybe I'll have a little time to discuss it here. I will ask you to ask the question, once you've really heard of what this drug maintenance program is for heroin users, why we should not and must not adopt a policy like that in every city in our country. It reduces crime. It reduces drug abuse. It increases the health of people. It increases their employment, their ability to support themselves, to pay their taxes, takes them off the dole, and increases drug treatment. So we need to come back with research. And fundamentally, I like to ask questions. It's what I do. Try to get answers occasionally. But ask you this, because I know the answer for me. It makes as much sense to me to put this gifted actor, Robert Downey Jr., in jail for his drug abuse as it would have Betty Ford in jail for her alcohol abuse. Is there any difference? And the answer has to be no. I used to say that about Darryl Strawberry. You all remember him, very gifted baseball player, truly has a cocaine problem from what I understand. However, he was arrested and convicted and sent to jail not long ago for driving a motor vehicle under the influence of cocaine. And you know what I say to that? Good. Precisely what should happen. The criminal justice system is very much geared up to address people's actions. And if anyone's actions, by taking drugs and then their actions put us at risk, put us at jeopardy, bring them to me. And that is exactly where the criminal justice system should respond, and will, and very effectively. Drug courts, a marvelous program. You don't understand. And I've been doing this for 18 years. Drug courts are a positive revolution in the criminal justice field. I agree with Mr. Hutchinson on this. Drug courts almost always result in judges like me, prosecutors, probation officers, treating people as human beings, as individuals instead of numbers. Instead of being a fill-in-the-blank, junkie, dirtbag, whatever, they're now human beings with failings, with desires, with needs, with wants. And yes, they relapse. And we realize that, and we have a sanction. It's really the parent's patriae. You know, I am the father who can either spank or commend. And it works. It takes a lot of effort, though. It takes a lot of resources. But where we go wrong, where drug courts are a trap, and I mean that deeply, drug courts can and hopefully will not be used to perpetuate the same failed system. We should not we must not bring people into the criminal justice system because of what they put into their bodies. Flat out mistake. What you do instead is hold people accountable for what they do. And if they come into the criminal justice system because of their actions, like 95% of all spousal abuse cases are alcohol related, things like that, driving under the influence, and if they happen to have that substance abuse problem, put them in drug court and we'll deal with them there. Ronald Reagan, of all people, said it best. Ronald Reagan said, "It is the function of government to protect us from each other." And I agree with him completely. But he went on to say that where government goes astray is where government tries to protect us from ourselves. And he's absolutely right. And that is the failing of the war on drugs. It is so artificial. It is destined for failure. It failed before, it is failing now, it is continuing to fail. And Ronald Reagan, unfortunately, failed to follow his own advice. But he was right. So we need to talk to people about these issues. And we need to tell them, again, don't be afraid. It's okay. It's the compassionate thing to do. There are other things to discuss as well. Economics, people naturally resist change. I understand that. That's perfectly logical. But we also have a perpetuation of the status quo that cannot be minimized. We have a government bureaucracy that has built up to continue to perpetuate the war on drugs that is colossal. In fact, as I refer to it, we have a runaway freight train of federal money in favor of the status quo. I ran for Congress, 1998. I was younger then, but talked to two sitting congressmen in Orange County, pretty conservative area, trying to get them to support my campaign against Bob Dornan, who you may have heard of, and I have the scars to prove it. But I talked to them to try to get them to support me, and they brought it up on their own. Of course, they were aware of my position with regard to drug policy. And they told me, said, "Jim, of course you're right. We in Washington really know that the war on drugs isn't working. But the problem is worse than you think. Because every federal agency we have gets extra money to fight the war on drugs. It is earmarked expressly in all of these budgets, this extra money, and they are addicted to the money. And it's not just the big guys, the obvious ones, like the military and the DEA and the Department of Customs, Bureau of Customs, Department of State, all the rest of that sort of stuff. It's the little guys, too. It's the Bureau of Land Management. It's the Department of Agriculture, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. All of these organizations as well get extra money earmarked to fight the war on drugs. And do you think they want to give it up? And of course the answer is no. So they take extreme positions. We take extreme positions because it's our government and it's up to us to call a halt to it. They will not do it. What are some of these extreme positions? One of them truly is medical marijuana. Okay? Okay. One of them is medical marijuana, where they are beating up on sick people. Another one is hemp. You should all be aware of hemp. Hemp is the marijuana stalk. It has no psychotropic properties whatsoever, but has been used traditionally for thousands of years as a viable commercial product. And the hemp seeds as well. They can be manipulated so that they have no form of psychotropic properties whatsoever. And there are all of these products that have been used traditionally over time that are very, very constructive and helpful in society. In fact, back in the ancient Greek word, the word cannabis and canvas were one of the same thing. So we, of course, have outlawed this entire industry, except during the Second World War. You ought to see Hemp for Victory sometime, actually a show produced by the Department of Agriculture talking about the beneficial usages of this for tow ropes, etc. But time is fleeting. But I can tell you that now our federal government is taking another extreme, in fact, downright silly position. So we are trying to keep out from our country the imports of hemp products from other countries, such as Canada and England, you know, those liberal, wild-eyed countries. So, products such as clothes, 2x4s, lacquer. I use hemp shampoo. Used it this morning. It's widely commercially available. They would talk literally about keeping this out of our country. What, to protect us? Do they think I'm going to get high from snorting shampoo? It is unbelievable what we are doing. It is downright silly. But this is the policy of the government of the United States of America. So we need to tell our people, don't be afraid. It's okay. It is the economically prudent thing to do. We do have hope. We do have hope. Look what's going on in Switzerland. Look what's going on in Holland. These will be on our programs tomorrow. We must deprofitize these drugs somehow. We must medicalize them so that we utilize the medical community more in addressing these very serious needs. And, of course, use the criminal justice system to hold people accountable for their actions. We can do that. So finally, because it's up to us, it is our government, and we are the ones who must call a halt to this. And I'm reminded that there was a story one time where a man was on the earth and saw all of these problems with all of the poverty and all of the suffering, and finally died, went to heaven, and had an occasion to speak with God. And he looked at God, and he actually raised his fist to God and said, "How can you, with all of the poverty and all of the suffering and disease and killing, why don't you do something?" And God shook his head and looked back at him and said, "I did do something. I sent you." It's up to us. If we want to do something significant for our country, and I know we all do, we cannot do anything more important than repeal drug prohibition and stop visiting these problems upon ourselves. When we finally repealed alcohol prohibition, you may not be aware of this, crime went down countrywide after 1 year by 65% and continued to go down each year thereafter until the beginning of the Second World War. So these are the most critical issues facing our times. Our policy of drug prohibition, with all of the killing and destruction and harm that it is visiting upon ourselves. We do have hope. We do have options. And to those who agree that it is in fact long since time to move beyond the war on drugs, I leave you with the thought, don't be afraid. It's okay. It's the right thing to do. Thank you all.